WWII Misha here, and I recently put out a pretty long video looking at German World War II U-boats, including this model here. This is the really most common general type, Type 7. And in this video, I want to talk about a much larger submersible. France's Surcouf Undersea cruiser. And the reason they call it an undersea cruiser instead of an outright submarine is really this is primarily a cruiser. Now, the reason it existed, at least one of the reasons, was the Treaty of Washington, or the Washington Treaty, which post-World War I set pretty severe strictures on the tonnage and abilities and just general numbers of surface vessels that the powers of the world could build and deploy. This included battleships and cruisers, but it didn't mention smaller ships like destroyers or what were considered secondary ships like submarines. So to that end, in 1926, France designed the Corsair type or class undersea cruiser and ordered the first one, Surcouf, be built. It was laid down in 1927 and launched in 1929. And it was commissioned, finally, after protracted trials and testing. It was commissioned in 1934. And this saw service during the first half of World War II and had a very colorful, if not altogether glorious, career. But really, this is a technically impressive machine, but not without its shortcomings. And the reason I said it's more of a cruiser than a submersible as such is its main armament are these two deck guns, which are actually 8-inch guns, naval guns, which were the common guns that France would fit to their heavy cruisers. Quite powerful. The guns themselves had a range of 24 miles. It also had a couple of 37mm anti-aircraft guns, as well as a few rapid-fire anti-aircraft machine guns. On top of that, it carried one float plane in the back here for observation and reconnaissance, making it technically an aircraft carrier. And furthermore, it carried two small boats, powered boats for various things, all of which typically submarines of the day did not have. And overall, this was a gargantuan machine for what it was. It was over 360 feet long, had a standard crew of 8 officers and 110 enlisted or NCOs, but it could actually have about a dozen more. Sometimes you see the crew stated from 110 to 130. On top of that, it could carry 40 passengers or 40 prisoners in a hold, and or 280 tons of cargo. It had a very good range considering it just under 12,000 miles, had large fuel reserves, and it had enough provisions on board for its standard crew of 118 to last 3 months, 90 days without resupply. And she was pretty fast too, all things. It could go about 21.5 miles per hour surfaced. So not a speed demon, but not all that slow. As far as its submarine elements, well, it obviously could submerge. I've actually had a hard time finding out its maximum depth, but a routine depth seems to be around 300 feet. Some sources claim it could go down to about 500 feet without much danger, even deeper. It did have torpedo tubes in addition to its big guns. It had 4 22-inch tubes in the front, just fixed standard tubes. Quite interestingly, in the rear, it had 2 swiveling mounts, kind of destroyer style, and each of these mounts had 1 22-inch torpedo tube and 2 16-inch torpedo tubes. That brings the grand total of tubes up to 10, 6 larger, 4 smaller. It also carried reloads for a total torpedo count of 22 on board. So, not bad, considering all else it was carrying. Under the surface, it was actually quite fast for its day. It could do about 12 miles per hour, whereas most German subs of World War II, at least into the Electro boat, could do 8 to 9 miles per hour underwater. So yeah, pretty impressive machine, but it did have shortcomings, and this kind of explains the protracted testing. Some of these, but included, it was very slow to dive, not surprisingly considering how long and heavy it is. It also was hard to trim underwater, and above water it had pretty bad roll. Also, because on the surface it was still a submersible, it rode pretty close to the water line, and therefore the guns had a hard time being aimed at distance because of visibility. In fact, they were limited to under 7 miles range when just normally using the spotter in the turret. If they put up the periscope and used it as a de facto spotting device, they could get nearly 10 miles range. But if they wanted to use the full 24 miles range of the guns, they had to deploy their observational aircraft, which they did, at least in theory. Most of its problems really did have to do with the guns themselves. It was a watertight turret, but still, and also just dive and maneuverability type things. It was relatively fast, but had a little hard time turning around and what have you. Still an impressive machine, though. Well, after some adjustments were made, this was commissioned into service in 1934, just in time for the new London Naval Treaty, which finally put restrictions on submarines. This was something Germany pushed for because it would allow them more freedom than they previously had experienced, especially in the submarine. It allowed Germany to have as many subs as Britain. But for France, it had a few negative things. For one, it limited submarines to about 2,800 tons, which was a problem because Surcouf was around 3,200 tons surfaced and 4,300 100 tons submerged, give or take. On top of that, the new treaty limited U-boats or submarines to guns of no greater than 6.1 inches. Obviously, 8 inches is a little more than that. So before France would sign, they had to make an exception, an exemption for Surcouf herself, which they did. Unfortunately, even though this was planned to be one of 3 Corsair types, because of the new treaty, the other ones were never built, which is kind of funny because it has a pennant number of 3. I guess they were going to go backwards, 2 and 1. Leaving this the only one of her type, her class, but nevertheless, very much the pride of the French Navy, and rightfully so. It was a technological and engineering feat. Throughout the 1930s, it did its thing. It went to French colonies, showed the flag, and was just generally part of the French Navy doing Navy things. Of course, this would all change when France would fall. At that time, Surcouf was undergoing a refit and upgrade in May of 1940. And so the refit and repair and upgrade was only partially complete, and it limped to the British port of Plymouth, where it sought safe harbor. But the problem is the British were worried because of the new Vichy government, which was technically allied with Germany, that France's not insubstantial naval assets would fall under the control of the Nazis. So they began Operation Catapult to prevent this. This basically was an order to French ships to either join the Allies, fight against Germany, to scuttle their ships and basically just step away, or to just take their ships out of the North Atlantic and therefore out of the combat zone. Some French ships complied, others did not. Surcouf was not one of the knots. Even though it was already in a British port, the Royal Navy tried boarding her on July 3rd, and this resulted in the first bloodshed, the first combat the vessel saw. Unfortunate. 3 Royal Navy sailors were killed, and 1 French sailor lost his life. Slightly odd, one of the British sailors killed was actually shot dead by the ship's surgeon, the ship's doctor. After this, though, of course, this was subdued. The British would then take possession of the ship, finishing her refit and upgrade. And then in August of 1940, they would hand her over to the Free French Navy. After that, she would be kind of assigned to convoy duty, stationed out of Canada in 1941. And this is where she was mostly used as a traditional cruiser instead of a submarine, helping ships get across the Atlantic, something they needed every ship they could get in that year. And then in April of 1941, she was attacked and pretty severely damaged by a German aircraft on the lookout for ships. So in July of 1941, she put into port in America and the USA, in New England, for repair and again a refit. This would last until November, and then she would go back to Canada. So at this point, America is ostensibly still neutral, but yeah, you know how that goes. Of course, December rolls around. On the 11th, Germany and Italy declare war on the USA, but interestingly, the USA and Vichy France were still nominally allies, or at least neutral, for another year. Nevertheless, on the 20th, Surcouf was assigned to a Free French task group to go liberate Saint-Pierre from the Vichy French. She got there on the 24th, along with her fellow ships, and liberated the island without any bloodshed. There was some protest from the Vichy French demanding that Roosevelt basically return the island, but, Charles de Gaulle, the immovable object, he basically just ignored him. So, no big deal was made out of it. With that said, the next decision in January 42 was to send Surcouf to the Pacific to fight the Japanese, a place where, again, every ship was needed after the attack on Pearl Harbor. America was desperate, and of course France had its own colonies over in Indonesia, Indochina, today Vietnam, so they had assets there as well. She had actually gone to the Panama Canal, but then contact was lost. On April 18th, 1942, the Free French publicized an article, a statement saying that Surcouf was lost with all hands on the night of February 18th/February 19th. To this day, no one knows for sure exactly what happened. One possibility is that an American merchantman ran her over. Again, this rode low in the water, was a submarine, and never stopped to check it out. It's also surmised that a PBY Catalina might have depth charged her, mistaking her for a German sub. And also, an American submarine may have torpedoed her. Of course, since this was the area of the Bermuda Triangle, the internet being the internet, there's a vocal minority that insists that the Bermuda Triangle swallowed her up, and I have to imagine that it's somewhere in the theories aliens were brought on board. So I'm going to go with aliens. I think Surcouf was taken into space. You remember the end of Season 2 of SeaQuest? Exactly that. That's what I think happened to Surcouf. So it'll probably just return when its time is right. So there you go. That wasn't the first conspiracy about this sub either. Even after it was handed over to the Free French, the British always seemed a little sketchy as to the crew's loyalty. So they would station 3 to 4 Royal Navy seamen on board, usually 1 or 2 officers and a couple of enlisted, just to kind of nominally help out and be advisors, but to keep an eye on the crew. So unfortunately, when the ship was lost, 4 British sailors lost their lives along with 126 French crew. So 130 total died. No survivors were ever recovered, of course, or would know what happened. No one has ever dived on the wreck as far as I know, or looked for her. But yeah, definitely an interesting boat. Just so big. It's relatively narrow, as you see, but the fact that it has 8-inch guns and even carried a seaplane and a couple of launches really does take it more into the realm of being a cruiser than a true purpose-built submarine. I mean, just looking at the size of this kind of tells you. I mean, this is not Germany's smallest U-boat, and yeah, there you have it. I mean, it's dwarfed by the Surcouf. But yeah, I just thought this would be a fun one to talk about. It's a very interesting ship and a very historical ship. It really was the pride of the Marine Nationale before and during World War II. And very unique in that it was the only one of its class. It also had some inspiration for Japan when they did their I-400 class, which, yes, I will get to. And as with the German U-boat model, this is a 1/350 scale from Atlas. And in that scale, this model is over a foot long. It's about 13 some odd inches, so pretty respectable. It's quite a bit of metal, the main hull, with of course the small bits, the guns being polymer plastic for detail purposes, and like the others, it is a cutaway. Which I'm kind of half and half on. I think the idea of being a cutaway, I know they did it to kind of give a little more added value, because there's not a whole lot to a sub, but it's neat, I guess. I kind of wish they'd done little plugs you could put in to make them not cutaways if you wanted, but other than that, I have no complaints. They come with nice little wooden stands and nice little metal placards giving the name and usually the date. Well, with that said, I'm going to let you go, make this one a shorter one. Any comments, feel free to post them below. If you'd like to just talk about the French Navy or French subs or whatever, French cuisine, let's do it. With that, this is Misha, and I'll catch you very soon next time.